What I want to talk about today is designing a future of human flourishing. And I'll explain what all that means. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about comes from a project, a program up at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences, CASBS, as we infelicitously call it, that is focused on creating a new moral political economy. And I'll explain that. This is a little book that just came out, and those of you who can access a university library system can download it for free, and the rest of you, should you be interested, need to buy it. It's not that expensive. And it was really made for classroom use. So what this program or project is all about is creating a large network of thinkers. We have about 100 people engaged with us right now, who come from virtually every discipline and every way of thinking about a problem, so they don't have to be academics, to really provide the thinking behind what a new political economic framework, a framework that encompasses the political structures, the social infrastructures, and the economic institutions that we need to run a society. Every society has, every country, every era has a political economic framework. And they have changed periodically every 20, 30 years or so. Some of you have lived through Keynesianism, maybe. All of us have lived through the Friedman period and the Hayek period of new classical economics, or neoliberalism, as some people call it. And we're probably right now ripe for a change. The technology, the demography, the market system, a lot of things have changed over the last 20, 30 years, and the political economic framework needs to adapt to that. And so periodically there is this big shift. And part of what we're doing is trying to provide the background, the framework, the ideas that might inform policy and practice as we go forward. So there are a couple of things about thinking about a moral political economy that I want to point out. First, as I've already said, there's changes inevitable. It happens periodically in terms of the political economic framework. So the status quo is not natural. It's not a given. It's something that's adaptable and will be subject to changes over time. The other thing I want to emphasize is what was the underlying idea about how humans behave under the neoclassical paradigm is that humans are individuals who are rational, a problematic assumption, and who are economically self-interested in a fairly narrow sense. What we've discovered over time in the behavioral sciences, including from important CASBS fellows like Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, is that people have limited rationality, that their rationality is not always, they have heuristics that inform what they think is the right thing to do or the rational thing to do. It's not really narrowly rational. It's not really thinking in rational terms. The other thing, and they are swayed by passions, they're swayed by misperceptions that can be corrected to some extent, but really transform our understanding of the underlying assumption that was behind neoclassical economics, which is that people could really figure out what was in their best interest. It's very hard to do. The other thing that we have learned over the years, or relearned, or should notice, is that people are very human animals. They're not just thinking about themselves and their family, they're interacting constantly. And those social connections, those social networks, the context in which they live, very much influence how they think and behave. So we want to build a model that's based on humans as we understand them now, not as they were assumed to be 30 or 40 years ago, right? The other thing I want to emphasize is that institutions matter. And what I mean by institutions are the rules of the game under which we operate. They can be literal institutions, as many of you are probably thinking about, like hospitals or universities, but they can also just be the rules that sort of govern our societies. And those matter a lot in terms of giving us options to do X or Y. So it's not just our individual decision-making or even our social decision-making that's influencing how we're behaving, but the structures under which we live and that guide our behavior, help tell us what the norms are, tell us what the rules are, limit our behavior, or encourage certain other behaviors. And the final point, in terms of our claims, is that all political economies are moral. If you go back to Adam Smith, which really is the beginning of capitalist political economic frameworks, there were values that informed that. The wealth of nations, people as having moral sentiments. So it's a question not of whether a political economy is moral, but whose values is it representing? What values does it incorporate? And we also want to challenge the values that are incorporated in the current political economic framework and think about ones that really bring us together or allow us to achieve human flourishing in a different sense than has been true in the past. Okay, so what are our goals in this big program? The first, of course, is the flourishing of people, and I would say the planet as well. We want to make people better off economically. That's always been a goal, the wealth of nations. Think measuring well-being by GDP, gross domestic product. But we want to go beyond material well-being to thinking about respect for each other, dignity, well-being in a variety of senses and not just in narrow economic material meanings. That means we have to rethink government. We have to rethink the economic institutions that we're working with, the kinds of markets and the operation of markets and other economic arrangements, and the social institutions that guide our interactions. My emphasis in the rest of this talk is only really going to be on the governmental institutions, but the project itself and the program and my own work really extends beyond the government, but I'm going to focus on the government in this talk. And finally, one of our goals is to create an expanded and inclusive community of fate, F-A-T-E, not faith, fate, ways in which our destinies are entwined and a recognition of that. And I'll come back to that point later because I want to end with a discussion of that and how we might create it. So hold that thought. Okay, so the questions I'm really going to focus on today is how to create a trustworthy government, which is an absolute sine qua non of a moral political economy. We have to figure out how to make government work for us and how to have confidence in it. So how do we create and sustain a trustworthy government? What are government's responsibilities to citizens? And what are citizens' obligations to each other and to government? Those are the questions I will address. And I want to emphasize that there are two parts to that of what makes a government trustworthy. Enactment, getting things done, making policies that serve people, but also engagement. A democratic government, at least, needs to engage its citizenry in thinking about where the society is going to go, what the policies should look like, how to do various things. Okay, so this is something I've developed over time with various colleagues and tested out in varieties of ways, which is what we call the virtuous circle, or what I call the virtuous circle of government. So it really starts with various parts of government which are built in a way that ensures that government will be, one, keep its promises, be competent and have the capacities to actually deliver on what governments should deliver on, whatever government has promised to do. Two, that it has fair processes according to norms of fairness of the time and place. So those have varied over history, obviously. And finally, that it is able to find and punish free riders. That people can't take advantage of each other and not pay their taxes or not do other things that the government expects of citizens and that citizens expect of each other. And those are the three crucial elements. And then there are these various ways of measuring them that are incorporated in this graph. If those things are achieved, people begin to feel that government is delivering to them and in a way that respects them. And they're more likely to believe government is trustworthy, which means that they're more likely to comply, more likely to obey the laws, which then improves the capacity of government to do more and to deliver more. That's the virtuous circle. Now, what I don't have in that graph, in that model, is this other piece of the picture, which I think is really crucial for democratic governments. And that's engagement by government of citizens. That means that the policies will reflect the values of an often very plural population. The US is a good case of a very plural population. Lots of different subgroups with lots of different ideas and values about how government should operate. It should facilitate a common perception of and cooperation around the general goal. So it should create a real capacity of citizens to work together and to think of themselves as one. Processes for involving and listening to the various interests and values that are part of the country, part of the polity. And finally, it has to be a democratic government depends on consent, behavioral consent. That's a form of willing compliance. So I've developed a notion called quasi-voluntary compliance, which is even under conditions where something is required by law, such as taxes, we still depend. You don't want a Fed under every bed. We still depend on a large degree of willing compliance, even with that. But certainly in a whole variety of other domains, take up on various policies, we'll get to mask mandates and vaccines later in the talk. It's important to think about evoking from citizens a willingness to go along with what the government is expecting and requiring. And that's tricky in some cases. So let me make a couple of addendums here, just so I'm as clear as can be. Trustworthiness is almost never perfect. It's a continuum. Moreover, some agencies or agents of government could be perceived or understood or act in more trustworthy ways than others. So you could distrust the police, but have confidence in your teachers and the educational system, whatever it is, right? So there can be lots of variation, and there can be variations among populations in regard to that. So trustworthy is always in process. It's a continuum. It's a constant thing that we have to build, rebuild, rethink, worry about in the variety of domains. Second, a vicious cycle is always possible. It's very easy for a good government to slip. We've seen some evidence of that in the last couple of years. Third, it's very important. So we want there to be a trustworthy government, but we don't always want citizens to be totally trusting. We expect in a democracy a healthy skepticism, right? That's part of what we think about as democracy. People should be challenging the facts they get. They should be asking questions, and there should be a way to resolve that. So skepticism is healthy. Too much skepticism can be unhealthy if it goes too far. But it's healthy to have some distrust of government, mistrust of government built into the system. That's how the American Constitution was actually developed, with some skepticism built into it and a series of safeguards in case there are knaves in the government. And finally, one of the things that we've learned over the years in thinking about what makes a government trustworthy is that policy changes can have consequences that are positive for some groups and negative for others, leading to people feeling that something that has changed is unfair. And I'll give you a little story about that Arlie Hochschild, in her wonderful book, Strangers in a Strange Land, or in Their Own Land, Strangers in Their Own Land, discusses about the people of the Louisiana Bayou. They feel like they have waited patiently in line for years, and waiting for the advancements, looking at the people ahead of them who've done so well, and thinking they'll get there too if they just wait in line for their turn. And from their perspective, suddenly a whole bunch of other people are cutting in front of them in line, and they think that's very unfair. Meanwhile, those people who are supposedly cutting in front of them in line have been waiting even more patiently for even longer for some benefits from the society. So it's a complicated, doing something for one group can lead to distrust or a feeling of unfairness by another group. So getting this all together to create a really trustworthy government that most of us would feel confident in is not an easy process. So how do we figure out if a government is trustworthy? Well, I've already suggested to you that there's a limit to the concept of trust itself. A lot of people talk about trusting government, which is really about an individual perception, an individual attitude. Many of the surveys in the past asking about trust in government asked in it in such a generalized term that many people were saying, I like this president but not that president, and not really talking about the qualities of government itself, and whether objectively they felt that there was no corruption or that the agencies were pretty respectful of them or whatever it was. So trust as a measure of whether a government is a good government or not seems to me inadequate. You need to have that perception to some extent, but what I'm really emphasizing here are the objective features of a government, something that we can measure, we can look at, we can uphold a standard about, not just an opinion about, right? Okay, so there are limits, therefore, in my view, to the surveys that only ask about trust and distrust of government. Or even, as the surveys have gotten more sophisticated, they will ask about trust and distrust in the police, in the courts, in the civil service, in the IRS, or whatever. They'll have a whole list, so it's become a little more nuanced, which is better. But there's still real limits to those surveys. So my perspective is to look at behavior. What do people do in response to government demands and requests? How do they behave? Is it compliant? Is it non-compliant? Is it protest? Is it dissent? Is it healthy skepticism? Is it unhealthy skepticism? So that's how I think about how we ask this question. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen these kinds of charts. They're all over the place. This is one from Pew. And they show this, how trust in the government has declined, in the US government, has declined. There are a couple things to note in there. The high point here is the 1950s. I bet if we had surveys that went back, the 1930s wouldn't look so high in trust of government, right? So we've got this rosy-colored glasses on about the 1950s as being, and there's been this decline of trust when it's probably a big up and down ever since the US government was created, and that's probably true of all governments. The other thing you might notice is the big come down is in the 1960s. It starts to really decline around the time of the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, when there was real polarization and conflict within the country itself. It sort of comes back up, goes down again. It's not very high, but as I said, this is measuring our attitudes about government and not really what government is doing and whether it is actually trustworthy or not. Okay, let's think about how behavioral trust and mistrust would give us more information. And I'm going to give you some examples here, most of them from my own work, but not the COVID stuff. That's all using secondary work, others' work. So during the Vietnam War, there were protests and draft evasions by lots of people. Not the whole, the public was very, very divided during the war in Vietnam, in the US, in Australia, in Britain, in other countries, Canada, and other countries where there was some engagement, France, with the Vietnam War. But what was interesting there, if you look at the details of what went on, a lot of those people who engaged in that protest or engaged in the draft resistance were in fact trusting of the government in many other domains. They wanted the government to do certain things, that they didn't like those policies of the government. So that's an example of where you could believe the government is generally trustworthy, or trustworthy on domestic policy and untrustworthy on international policy, as an example. Okay, one of my favorite cases is the Francophones and Anglophones in Canada in the 2 world wars. So I'll show you that, and then I'll come back to the COVID responses in a minute. So this was the vote about conscription and whether to engage in conscription in 1943, whether to have conscription to go to war, World War II, in Canada. The orange is Quebec. The blue is all the Anglophone parts of Canada. Total split, right, in the country over that. Now, why did the Francophones feel so differently than the Anglophones? Well, during World War I, as well as during World War II, the Canadians' federal government, for whom some of the Francophones had voted, made the argument that Britain is under attack and France is under attack, therefore we're under attack. There were 2 things really wrong with that argument from the Francophone perspective. The first was they weren't France. France had left them on the ice floes in the 17th century and then had a revolution, and they didn't feel related to, and looked down at them, and they didn't feel related to France at all. But more importantly, the Articles of Confederation that made Canada a country between the Anglophone and the Francophone parts said you could not have conscription unless Canada itself was actually under attack. The actual territory of Canada was under attack. It certainly was not in either of those world wars. But equally important was that the Francophones had very little confidence in the federal government to keep its promises to them. They had promised to have dual language schools, which had never happened. They had promised all kinds of other goodies to the Francophones, which had never happened. And they were worried that they'd be fighting in the military, and the commanders would speak only in English, and they didn't necessarily understand English. So they'd be going forward while everybody else was being pulled back. So it was a very big split that really had to do with a behavioral, an indication of behavioral distrust of government. They refused to volunteer for the military. They voted against conscription. Okay, so now let's think about COVID, the period that we're in, the pandemic, and what we can understand about behavioral consent and dissent and trustworthiness of government in this period. Now, we know that there is an eternal debate about what the role of government should be. That dates back to the beginning of ever. I've studied the ancient Roman Empire. But it's also certainly dates back to the beginning of capitalism and the beginning of democracies. Adam Smith had a very limited, relatively limited role for government in his model of a political economy. John Maynard Keynes had a much more expansive role for government in his model of a political economy. But this debate goes on and on and on. Now, we saw during the Margaret Thatcher, Prime Minister of Britain, and Ronald Reagan, President of the United States, who really introduced and started to really push back in the contemporary post-World War II era on having big government. They wanted to reduce government considerably. And since that time, the Republican Party in the United States and various parties in other parts of the world have been weaponizing distrust of government. Not only have they been fighting for reducing the role of government, some of them have actually been actively engaged in making people lose faith in what government is doing and its capacity to deliver. Some of that's based on failure to deliver certain things, but some of it is based on real partisanship as opposed to reality of what government is doing. As a result, government is doing less which further undermines its trustworthiness, back to that virtuous circle. And that means that we are at the cusp of a vicious cycle of government, right? Where it does less, it can't deliver, then people dislike it, then it can't deliver more, and gets worse and worse. It spirals out of effect. The extreme partisanship we're experiencing right now clearly is affecting that. Just puts everything up into question. And finally, we're suffering from not only misinformation, which people obviously know about, and those of you who were at the last lecture would have heard something about that as well. But not only are we suffering from the misinformation that is provided by social media and the conspiracy theories, but there are also real information deserts. So when you look at the provision of COVID information, for example, where to get vaccines, what vaccines do, how masks will protect you, there are groups of the population who are totally clueless or confused. They really don't know what's going on. They don't have good sources of information. They don't know what sources of information to have confidence in if they're even getting information. So when all those things combine, you get some real problems, of course, with compliance with government. You would think COVID would have been a time when in the United States we might have all come together, maybe built that expanded and inclusive community of fate that I'd like to see us build. But when you have people who are trying to weaponize distrust, undermine what government is doing, when you have political leadership which doesn't want to deliver to certain groups and in certain ways, you can't achieve trustworthy government, and you can't achieve an expanded and inclusive community of faith. Now, one of the things that there's been a huge literature on COVID that has developed in the last, obviously, 19 months. Lots of information. It's actually a gift to a social scientist, this terrible disease. I don't think we should get those kinds of gifts, but we're going to take advantage of it. Every crisis has an opportunity, and this is the opportunity for the social sciences. There's just an incredible amount of data about who's doing what, who's gotten vaccinated, who hasn't, who's wearing masks, who isn't, who's resisting, who's just confused. Just a lot of information. And there's beginning to be some really good sorting out of that information, and so I want to report on a little of that. But before I go to the present, I want to tell you something about the past. One of the crucial things we are learning from the present is how important it is to have the message be targeted to the population it's supposed to reach, and that it be targeted in the right way. One of our fellows at the center last year, Purna Singh, is writing a book, which I really recommend when it comes out, which looks at the smallpox vaccination and its introduction into China and India in the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. And in India, people resisted the smallpox vaccination up until quite recently, when the messaging changed and it used things that the Indians believed in and understood around religious symbols and other things. In China, the uptake, both places had been subject to colonialism. Both places didn't believe a lot of the things the British told them because they'd been taken advantage of before. But in China, what happened was the local elites took up the message and decided that this was going to make the population healthier. So they messaged about the virus. They didn't rely on the British and the British officials to message about the virus. And they also used what they knew about Chinese medicine and how it could relate to the smallpox vaccination. Needles are not something that the Chinese fear. They do a lot of acupuncture. They use that in their traditional medicine. So they linked the smallpox vaccination to certain places where you get acupuncture. That changed the messaging and made the uptake of the vaccine much greater and much more easy. Now that lesson didn't seem to be learned at first in the US. I'm part of a group called Societal Experts Advisory Networks for the National Academies of Science and for the National Science Foundation. And the idea was to use social science expertise to help advance the messaging and help advance the uptake of the various health protections that we needed during COVID. And one of the things that we learned very early on as we listened to the public health people talk is that they tended to start with a top-down message that was one size fit all. They changed over time and got more nuanced, but their initial instinct was, this is good for you, the science says it's good for you, just do it. That was basically the story. What we learned was that different groups really needed different kinds of messaging. And they needed different kinds of people to be giving them the messages. There's a partisan divide on who provides the message. So a really excellent paper that one of the contributors is one of our faculty members, Rob Willer, in sociology, shows that when prominent Republicans give the message to Republicans, the Republicans are more likely to get the vaccine or to wear the mask or to engage in the other behaviors that are being expected. However, when a prominent Democrat delivers the message to Republicans, they're more likely not only to refuse, but to obstinately refuse. So that we really have to, my glasses are steaming up. So we really have to think about who's providing the message to whom and how. And we're learning a lot about how to do that better, at least in the United States. There are also some really interesting differences that have been revealed among the vaccinated, non-vaccinated who are willing to get vaccinated, maybe, and those who are totally resistant and non-vaccinated. I'll show you another. This is a word cloud of the words used by the vaccinated to explain their reasoning behind the decision. And you can see that it's all kinds of things that have to do with protecting other people, with the, willing to take the risks. The science says it's a good thing, taking care of your family, your community. These are the words used by the unvaccinated to explain their reasoning behind their intention. They don't trust government, they're skeptical about the science, it hasn't been tested long enough. So it turns out of the respondents of this survey, 67% of them were vaccinated. 18% were non-vaccinated and resistant, and 15% were unvaccinated but willing to be vaccinated. And they're the ones that the mandates are changing. We haven't figured out how to get to that other 18%, but most of those 15% said that it wasn't really distrust of government, they just weren't sure. They didn't understand the science. They just didn't understand it. Would it work? Would it not work? They were healthy young people, did they have to get it? It was those kinds of reactions. And another piece of that story was many of them were people who don't have health insurance, weren't sure whether they had to pay for it or not, or were in places where it was very hard to get the vaccine, or they were afraid they'd be sick the day after, that they have a reaction to the vaccine and they'd lose time at work and they couldn't afford to lose time at work. So those were people who were confused or unsure or needed a little push, and the mandates work for them. They don't work for the really resistant non-vaccinated, unless they don't work in terms of getting them to willingly comply. They may be forced to comply in one way or another. Okay, so what are the lessons that we can take away from what I've just told you? There are a bunch of lessons that I'm going to try to draw out of this. Universalism may not and probably should not mean uniform treatment. If you think about what our values are as a democracy, and as, in fact, almost any modern government. It's impartial government, it's universalistic treatment of all, it's policies that are supposed to reach to everyone. And that may be not the right way to go. It's not that we shouldn't have universalistic policies, but we shouldn't have uniform treatment. We have to understand those policies in a way that differentiate them among different populations. Now, we do that already. We have universalistic policies for which we make exceptions for the disabled, for the elderly, for very young people, children, babies. So, it's never been totally universal. But now we have to think about how to do this in a different kind of way. We can see the kind of polarization that occurs right now. We can see the kind of diversity that exists in our society, of values, of attitudes, of a whole bunch of things, and of situations, which is the most important part. People really are living different lived experiences. They have very different contexts in which they live, different kinds of communities, different kinds of needs, different kinds of incomes, all kinds of things which require some difference in treatment. So one size does not fit all. One size didn't fit all, as I've already told you, with the vaccine or with the mask mandates. The same message didn't work with everybody. The same rules don't work for everybody. You can't just tell people to get vaccinated if there's no place to get vaccinated, or they don't know where to go, or they can't take time off from work. So one size doesn't fit all. There are also problems with overly technocratic solutions. One of the things that we've been hearing is that there is increased distrust in science and experts. There doesn't seem to be as much evidence for that as you'd think. What there does seem to be is distrust in particular messengers, communicators of science. So those resistant 18% that I told you about, they say they trust science, fine, they don't trust Dr. Fauci, right? So it's not the science, it's Fauci. He's got it wrong. He's messed it up. So, we have to think about who's providing the message, but also understand that expertise is not the only thing we want to rely on, just as those public health people had to learn that. That we can think of many cases in our history where overconfidence in the expertise has led us down a problematic path. For example, the war in Iraq. We believe the experts, right? In other cases, if we don't believe the experts sufficiently, we can also get in trouble. We have too many COVID deaths in the United States because people didn't believe good science. Okay, and the other lesson that we've gotten is that it is an obligation of government not only to provide goods and services and to do that in a fair way and in a way that ensures that that the free riders, people can't free ride off of us and exploit us. The government also has an obligation to enhance social solidarity. So I have a better metaphor here than Arlie Hochschild's, I think. Rather than people waiting in line, which is appropriate to a world of limited resources and relative stability in a world of a zero sum, we can grow the pie. And we have grown the pie. Better for the world would be not better for the world to have these natural disasters, but better to think about the world as one in which there are natural disasters and diseases that are inevitable. But we don't know when they'll come. We don't know what their impact will be on us or our community, which means we all are in it together. We have to be prepared for these things. We know they're going to happen. And we know that for those who are affected, they're going to need help. They're going to need the help of other people. That's social solidarity. But they're also going to need the help of government because we've seen lots of floods and disasters where people have really risen to charitable giving and giving their time and themselves and racing across the country to help others. But ultimately, we need a government to come in and rebuild in a whole variety of ways. Physical infrastructure, social infrastructure, economic infrastructure. So we do need government. And we need to recognize the plurality of our society, respect our differences, engage in establishing a government capable of effective and fair interventions. Those are our obligations, to engage in that way. And hold government accountable to act in the common weal. And thus reestablish a virtuous circle of trust, of a trustworthy government. That will help create the flourishing we need for a new moral political economy. It enhances the capacities of its peoples while recognizing the differences among them. It encourages and facilitates productive engagement of citizens with each other, generates social solidarity, supports innovation while mitigating the problems caused by innovations. It was mentioned that I'm the co-chair with Rob Reich of the Ethics, Society, and Technology Hub, and a lot of what we're doing is thinking about how to mitigate the problems of innovation while encouraging innovation, technological and scientific. And finally, flourishing in a new moral political economy means protecting the planet and all its species, human and other. I think that's it. These are some of the books that I have written, and then once again, A Moral Political Economy, Present, Past, and Future. Thank you.